They're out there, lots of them. They blend in and sometimes we don't even know they're there. The closest one is just 4 miles away. So what is it we're talking about? Any ideas? We're talking about prisons. Most of us have probably never even been to a prison or experienced how harsh they are. We might not even know where they are. Before I get to the main point today, I want to briefly talk about the purpose of prisons. According to the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology, the first U.S. prison was built in 1790 on Walnut Street in Pennsylvania. Now that was a while ago, but the purposes of prisons has remained unchanged. The two main purposes of prisons are, for one, to ensure the sentence is carried out that fits the crime, and two, proper rehabilitation for the individual is made. Now why does that matter? Rehabilitation is directly correlated to the rates in which individuals are subject to reoffend. Currently, the U.S. has the highest incarceration rate and has the highest recidivism rate in the world. From the research I've conducted in the past couple of weeks, I can say for certain that the change is needed with the rehabilitation in prisons. When I'm finished today, I hope you're all convinced that there are issues with the current prison rehabilitation by first learning some background information on prisons, and then understanding the reincarceration rates of inmates, and then finally learning the current rehabilitation plans that U.S. prisons use and comparing that to the rehabilitation plan of another country. So first, I want to give a little background information on prisons and how it relates to prison rehabilitation. So like I said before, there are two main purposes of prisons. The first main purpose is to serve time for the crime that was committed, and secondly, but arguably more important, rehabilitation of inmates. So starting with the purpose of prisons, it's known as incarceration, which is the act of being imprisoned. The U.S. has the highest incarceration rate among any nation. According to prisonstudies.org, the United States has the highest incarceration rate with over 2 million inmates. That's 1 out of 150 Americans. That's every 1 out of 150 Americans is currently imprisoned right now. The country with the second highest incarceration rate is China, with little over 1.5 million. This number is still high, but it's justifiable as China has almost 1/7 of the world's population at 1.4 billion. So now the second but more important point of prisons is the rehabilitation of inmates. A quote from crimemuseum.org specifically talks about the purpose of rehabilitation, and it says, "The basic idea of rehab through imprisonment is that a person who has been incarcerated will never want to be sent back to prison after they've been set free." This is true. Like, why would somebody want to go back? That's the purpose of rehabilitation. Rehabilitation of individuals in prisons not only affects them, but also people including ourselves. So, for example, say for instance, an individual commits grand larceny, stealing over $1,000. It's a Class H felony, punishable to 25 months in prison. If that individual doesn't get the proper rehabilitation, he or she might reoffend, therefore worsening his or her chances in pursuing a normal life. But also, the rehabilitation of that individual affects us. If that offender decides to go steal again, it could be from us, therefore affecting us when we had no connection whatsoever. So now that you understand the purpose of prisons and why rehab is important, I want to discuss the recidivism of rates in the U.S. So the recidivism rate is essentially just the rate of reincarceration of an individual. If somebody commits a crime, they're incarcerated. When they're set free, they're free, and then if they commit another crime, they are reincarcerated, which adds to the recidivism rate. So there was 2 studies done that I found. The first was done by Texas Christian University, and a sample of almost 400 people. 41% of them returned to the custody of prisons. 7 in the first year, 20 in the second year, and 14 returned in the third year. Another study done was a 9-year study done by the U.S. Department of Justice. In a sample of over 400,000 people, prisoners, they were released from custody in 2005. Of that 400,000 people that were released, 44 of them were arrested at least once in the first year. Now the trend continues for 9 years, and by the 9th year, 83% of the original 400,000 people returned to custody. Now what does that tell us? Are prisons just made for housing criminals to keep them out of society? Or are they actually doing what they're supposed to do? Rehabilitate individuals. With an 83% failure rate in 9 years, it seems that the Department of Justice is not doing a very good job at rehabilitation. Just for comparison, the country with the lowest recidivism rate is Norway, with only 20%. So now that you've learned a little bit about that, I want to talk about the current rehabilitation in prisons in the U.S. today. So currently, Rehabilitation is theoretically obtainable. We offer programs such as furthering education. Prisoners can go in classrooms and they can learn how to read and write, they can learn new material, and more importantly, they can learn how to educate themselves. So that's one of the strategies. The only other strategy we use is sort of like a scare tactic. So prisons are harsh places where incarcerated individuals have to live with one another. This fear of running into one another, starting fights, living in a cell, it's a fear. And the fear of having to go back to prison after being freed is said to act as a form of rehabilitation, thus reducing recidivism. So why doesn't this work? Why is there still an 83% failure rate? The answer lies with the mental state of the prisoners. They're left with emotional trauma, despair, anger, stress, and other stuff. Prisoners are locked away and able to talk about their trauma, why they committed the crimes, and being imprisoned in these cold cells with really dangerous other criminals, it just makes everything worse. Talking about issues with counselors or doctors will have a huge impact. Studies have shown that meditation or other forms of stress management could reduce the trauma, therefore lowering the recidivism rate in the US. Now, comparing this to another system in a different country, in Norway's prisons. In Norway's prisons, they have a 20% recidivism rate. That is 20% return to prison rate. So there's a prison in Norway called Bestøy. It's a island prison, and Bestøy allows prisons to take academic and technical courses. This allows them to further their education and allows them to seek employment while in prison. And another thing that's really cool about them is that they allow prisoners to work outside the prison up to 18 months before they're even released. This allows them to interact with society and help them easily transition back into the real world. They also live in apartments, free from barbed wires, fences, and can even go for a swim. That's all fine and dandy, but the most important aspect that Bestøy has is cognitive behavioral therapy, which improves the prisoner's mental health before they're even released. This really drastically decreases their recidivism rate. So in conclusion, with this speech, you have learned that rehabilitation in prison is needed to be reformed. You've learned this by understanding incarceration and recidivism rates in the US. You've also learned that the rehabilitation of individuals in prisons is essential for them, but also for you and your safety. By comparing our unsuccessful system of rehabilitation to Norway's, you can see that change can happen and improvement can be made. I hope that you now understand the importance of prison rehabilitation and how it affects every aspect of our society. Prisons aren't just made to house criminals for their crimes they've committed. It isn't just a place where we keep dangerous individuals away from us. Unless they're in a prison for life, they will one day be reunited with society, and if they don't receive the proper rehabilitation, they will act again. Thank you.